Good afternoon, everyone. We have today a couple of speakers who will be talking about misogyny in fiction and in space. Our first speaker is Layla Martin, who is a very multidisciplinary space theorist. She talks about all sorts of issues related to space and is involved with a variety of groups that are working on space issues in one way or another. You can follow her on Twitter at @FreeBarbarella. That's a cool handle. Next, we have Adam Mann, who is a journalist that writes about space. You can find some of his work in publications such as The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, Nature and Science magazines. You can also find him on Twitter at Adam Spaceman with double N. That's a clever use of your last name, Adam.
Thanks.
So now I'll pass the floor to Layla Martin.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for having us. Adam and I are really happy to be here and to talk about this because I think it's very relevant given if you just look at the news every day, it feels like space is in the news constantly. And Adam and I just saw this as an opportunity to discuss the current state of space culture. So Adam, I was thinking maybe should we say how we met? We are in kind of the same circles, and I think that's like a funny story. I read your New Yorker piece and I loved it, and I'm a fan of your work. And I typed out an email to you, and I didn't send it because I was afraid. Like, I don't know, I'm just nervous. And then I joined Twitter and I saw you followed me and I thought it was a mistake because I'm not good at Twitter. And I asked my daughter if it was true and she said, yes, it's not a mistake. And so then I wrote to you. So it's just kind of like a funny story that you have, like you a fan of someone you already like and you have an email and then like you didn't send it. And so I'm so happy that we're doing this today because it's like, it's cool to have someone you really like that you get to work with.
Well, and I followed you because I saw you had, I think it was your first article in the Space Review, and I was like, okay, well, this person is clearly doing cool stuff, is doing stuff that I'm interested in, the kind of stuff that I want to see people talking about, and it's very easy to follow people on Twitter. I was very happy when you emailed me, and since then we've like talked a bunch of times, and it's always just, sometimes it's about space, but it's often just kind of like riffing.
We're gonna try to keep it on track.
Exactly.
We have a lot of other stuff we could talk about, but so let's just start out with like the current state of space culture. And recently I wrote another piece for Space Review about the problem with space cowboys. And it was, I would say, like a critique of, you know, what's happening and how it's perceived in the media and by the public. And so
I want to go ahead. No, well, I want to ask you, what do you think is the current state of space culture? Like, what do you mean, I guess, when you say that?
Well, I feel like I see a lot of competition and the desire to be first and sort of go up to space and use it. I mean, I have kids, so it's like the ride Space Mountain at Disneyland is really cool, and I would like to go up and have it be reality. But I feel like given everything that's going on in the United States and on Earth right now particularly, but my focus is climate, that if we had more of an emphasis on using space-based assets and technology and developing ideas to mitigate climate, to adapt to climate, to really focus on climate, that would be better. I love space. I love space exploration, and I would completely go up if I were invited. So I think at times some of my writing has been maybe misunderstood, that like I don't like it because I'm criticizing the way that what's happening right now. One of the other points I make is like before when it was NASA, it felt like we're united. all kind of cheering for space. And now it kind of feels like you're trying to pick your favorite like member of a boy band. Like it's like, I like this one. Well, no, I'm into SpaceX. And it's like,
Right.
it's not like uniting us, you know what I mean? So
Sure.
I have a problem with that, because I feel like, as someone who's invested their work in thinking about space and studying space, that like it doesn't come off well to the public of like what's happening right now.
Right.
So
Right.
some people are vehemently opposed to that idea, but I don't know. I'm not the only one that feels that way. So
Definitely not. I think that there's, I mean, you know, like I said, I tweeted about this, and also just we talked about this before. I think that the biggest thing is that there is kind of this dominant narrative in space of we have to go. It's so important that we go. It's our destiny. We need to make life multiplanetary. And there is a little bit of a need for an alternative to just come in and say, like, why?
right.
And does that need to happen this year? Does this need to happen this decade? Does this need to happen this century? Like, the Earth isn't going anywhere for literally billions of years. So, you know, the rush is the thing that I find the most kind of artificial about it. And it's really more just about, well, I want this to happen now because I'm alive now, and I think this is cool. So
Right. And like, I think it was recently the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, I hope I pronounced that right, at the General Assembly on Tuesday, he criticized billionaires for joyriding to space while millions go hungry on Earth. And so again, it's not, there is a dominant narrative, but there's also, you know, a counterpoint, and we're not hearing about it as much because space is cool and going up there is cool. And so I think it's like, if you're in the newsroom, my background is in entertainment, I'm going to think, well, people will tune in to see about a rocket or this. And, you know, I think with the COVID factor is we're all tired of sad news and bad news and trauma. And we want I think the space, you know, unites us and lifts us all up and makes us feel like there are these wonderful possibilities. I mean, I remember in 2020 when we were on like lockdown, and there was that space broadcast, and it was like so exciting. It was live. I don't remember the name of it right now, but the point is that it makes us feel like there's hope, like there is a sense of like other worlds, and like you're a kid again, you know what I mean? And so I think that's the good part about space and why we're excited about it. But I think we need to really consider how we can use that technology and what other ideas are out there that we haven't, you know, come up with yet. Because one of the arguments I make is that the way we think about space is conceived of by a very small handful of people.
mm-hmm.
And in my research, you know, I looked at 60 different space companies and organizations around the world, and not one was founded by a woman. And so I think that matters, because women are definitely in positions of power in, you know, SpaceX or Blue Origin for sure. But carrying out the vision of a man is different than getting to decide what that vision is yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And when I have brought that up, the comments have been, well, no one is stopping you from starting.
other than our patriarchal society. And
well, one thing that is a barrier to entry is access to investment capital. And so, you know, if you just think about that piece, it takes a lot of money to start a space company. And I found this, according to the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School, nearly 3/4 of American VC firms don't have a single female investing partner. So it's not just like my feelings. I mean, this is all very like data driven,
Mhm.
you know, fact based. Women don't have the same access to investment capital that men do,
Mhm.
and women and minorities. So you say, okay, why don't we have more space companies by different people? Well, it takes a lot of money. So, you know, I think one of my initiatives in terms of like astrofeminism is like, let's uncover those barriers to entry and then try to work on, you know, what it is. And so when you say, when people say, well, you don't have there's nothing stopping you. And it's like, well, not like a law against me starting a company, but you know, and there are in my research a lot of barriers to entry that we don't think about. That
And that it's important to shine a light on, or you know, just even just recognize that they exist, because otherwise you just go, well, this is the natural state of things. Oh, you know,
exactly.
maybe men are just more interested in space and whatever, but there's structural things, you know, underlying that. So
Yeah, I think for sure. And one of the things that really surprised me recently is the feedback I got on uh, the article about astrofeminism, the theory of astrofeminism, is the climate deniers. And I mean, to be honest, I know they exist, but I thought like we were further along in um, that like, like that we know that that exists. And I was surprised because we're talking about the space review, which space people and science people, and so I was really surprised at like how many people were saying that that's not even really a thing.
yeah, there's it's not widespread, but I've certainly run into it in speaking with sometimes very prominent people about who are very gung-ho about exploring colonizing Mars and stuff like that, who said like, well, but climate change is going to be just like good for us because stuff is just going to be warmer. So, and like there's more carbon dioxide for plants, and like, and it's not necessarily climate denialism, but it is a form of not quite facing the facts and just wishing away that, and saying like, well, but let's focus on the thing that I want to focus, which is getting to other planets.
Well, yeah, absolutely. If you just look at, let's not look at like the human cost or emotional cost. Let's just look at it like climate from a financial perspective. I mean, according to Morgan Stanley, so far climate disasters have cost $650 billion in the last 3 years. So like let's separate it out of like not talking about, you know, the poor people, that the poorest 1 billion people on our planet, it's about to get a lot worse for them. But let's just talk about it from a financial perspective, that, you know, it doesn't make sense. I mean, the cost of inaction completely defies reason. And so when I talk about 3 initiatives that are pretty obvious, you know, using space for climate, increasing education and science awareness. And I'm not talking about like Mars and the stars. I'm talking about how many adults don't understand how satellites affect every single aspect of their lives. Just that. I think it's really important to increase knowledge of how space affects everything, because the people that I talk to, not in the academic community, are like really surprised. So that tells me like, you know, maybe we need to go beyond like the 4th grade, like styrofoam balls planet project, and like increase. We talk about space in the news all the time, but we don't talk about how space affects Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one. And then my 3rd initiative is like uncover what the barriers to entry are for females and minorities to start and establish and found space companies, and then address those. If it's access to investment capital, you know, then that needs to be considered. I mean, you know, we've got a million other reasons why: time poverty, motherhood penalty, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I could go on forever, but like, why those 3 things seem pretty obvious to me. And yet the pushback I got was like,
So I think one of the things that people, because and I hope that you're not trying to say, because I think we can do many things at once. Like we can also explore space and send people and hopefully lots of robots, which is what I would like to see.
Totally.
While also doing these things. And I think a lot of people I looked at the comments on your article as well, and people were like, oh, the same old warmed over tired arguments of we need to fix everything here on Earth before we can go into space. And I don't think that's what you're saying. I think that you're just saying that, okay, our priorities do seem a little bit lopsided and we could be doing more in this other direction while also continuing, like it wouldn't actually cost that much, or it wouldn't take away that much from the things that, people want to do in space. So
exactly. And I think as a mom of 4, multitasking is like, my entire life. And so of course, I'm not saying like, we can't do this at all. We only need to do this one thing. That doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying it feels like when we're looking at what's happening in the news and in the private sector, we're really focused on humans going up to space. Again, I think that's very cool. I would totally go if like somebody invited me. So again, I'm not saying that that's wrong. I totally agree with you that we should be focusing way more on robots going up to space because it makes more sense.
They don't need to sleep and eat, and like they don't have
like whatever
psychological problems that they're gonna worry about. So yeah.
We have a question from Kelly. She asks, what do women need in space science and the space industry?
Yeah, you want to take that?
Well, I guess I'm a little bit confused about the question. So in terms of what do we need, access. So I think I talked about it a little bit in terms of like,
So sorry to interrupt. The full question is, yes, what do women need in science and space industry? I ask because I have been asked this question. To me, it is obvious, but what would you say are your top 3 things to do to keep women involved in space science and industry?
That's a fantastic question. I would say one of the feedback that I received upsettingly and shockingly, but not surprisingly, is the level of harassment women receive, not on so many different levels, but just the women I interviewed for my research, sexual harassment and harassment in the workplace and a hostile work environment. I mean, I think that if you just look at like some of the different stories that are out there, it's like, why would you want to be involved in this kind of industry when you have to deal with that? I personally have dealt with it and almost gave up on the whole thing and didn't want to be part of the scientific community or the space community because it was predominantly men and I wasn't treated well or regarded very well, or taken seriously. I don't know. I think it's a lot of things. I think that's one thing that we need to talk about. I read some data from the Astronomers Association that a lot of the women there, they had gotten through all of the schooling and then they went into the workplace and they left because of this issue is a big problem. And then in terms of keeping women in the science and space community, I think it's what I discussed is, addressing the barriers to entry, and the financial barrier is one, but there are a lot of different systems of oppression that we don't even think about, the way that our society is set up, that need to be dealt with. And I think it's really exciting. I'm an optimist because we're talking about it. So that's good. It's a first step and it's very different from when I was a kid. I'm 45 and it's like a completely different world, the way that we're allowed to have these discussions. And like, I was raised with like, we're grown-ups, don't ask. We're not going to talk about anything. So it's good. I think it's good. It's positive. We're having a conversation about it. So what else I have here? I was going to talk about Adam's piece in the New Yorker. You wrote, space still exists mainly in our imaginations, and we all imagine it differently.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much about that piece that I found really moving, but that is like, it really hits home because we do imagine it differently. And the way that we interact with space is, you know, it's kind of like this one tunnel vision. And it doesn't mean that women aren't invited to share ideas. I mean, NASA just had conferences this week about expanding different possibilities within space and encouraging different ideas. And they have this grant money. I mean, it's all really exciting. So I think that's one thing I find frustrating is if you make a point and someone will pick out, well, what about this? Well, there are good things. There is a positive thing. Yes, women exist in the space community, but I'm not saying they don't. But what did you mean by that? That it exists?
It's a great line that you picked out actually, or just like because of what we're talking about, the thing that I wanted to bring up, in terms of also women's access to space and minorities' access to space is that at the basis of a lot of this is what we're talking about here is culture and science fiction that was written in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that inspired a lot of the current people who are really gung-ho about space, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and whoever, and was written predominantly, or at least the names that people think of are predominantly white men. And again, that's not to say that there weren't women and minorities writing science fiction at the time. We just tend to not really include their thoughts. They're not part of the canon. And we often talk about science fiction as a way of inspiring and predicting the future. But I want to also think about the ways that it constrains our thinking. Like if this is our one particular vision of the future, then we're not looking at other alternatives, and you're not even recognizing that there might be alternatives. Like again, people like based on his public comments, I don't have any access to Elon Musk's inner thoughts, but he has a particular vision of space, and it seems like it would make him sad if that was not what was happening. Like that
Right.
we're not living in this really cool 1960s sci-fi future. And I'm
Totally.
like, that's great, but maybe there's other things. Maybe the current state of things is actually just fine in its own way, and you have to hold space for that. And I think it would be important to recognize the contributions, yeah, that other people have made to these thoughts, and just ask more people about like, what do you think? What should our future in space look like?
Exactly. And I think what's like so surprising to me is just bringing it up, is saying, is there a counter perspective? What would that look like? You know, you get accused of being like a socialist, and all of a sudden it's like, wait, what? Like, it's like that's just asking about different ideas. You know, I feel, with my voice and my research, that politics has nothing to do with this. It's really important to me to be inclusive in terms of not one political party, because I'm looking at this in terms of climate and how it affects all of us, but mostly the poorest people. I mean, I think that that's really, for me, like, it's surprising the visceral like reaction and the pushback and like the anger, and it's just like, why can't we? It's like you said, I don't think you're saying it has to be this one way, and it's like,
That's
why can't we have
specifically what we're trying not to say. I would hope. I would
exactly.
hope.
No, it is. And I think one thing that gets skipped over is the privilege that people with billions of dollars, I mean, I don't know, I've never been a millionaire or like maybe a thousandaire. So it's like, I don't know how that feels to be able to make those kinds of decisions. And I imagine that you would have a lot more support than a regular person who's trying to handle and juggle, career and family and COVID and all of this different stuff that's happening, that there's a lack of support. And so we have time poverty, and we're trying to just put it all together in the best way that we can. And so I think it's important to consider that, like, maybe they just don't know or care about, what it's like to be a regular person. Maybe if you're that wealthy for so long, you lose touch. I mean, I remember when COVID first started and we had the lockdown, and I think it was like some entertainment CEO that was like, I'm just going to be quarantining on my yacht. And it was like, what? Like what? It's just, we have very different realities, you know what I mean? And so I feel like bias plays a really important part in that, and that trying to understand our own personal bias and then question, like, what do you have a feeling about that you just know that's true? And is it true? And really being aware of that. But it's like, I feel like the people that need to be questioning that are like not open to even talking about it. You know what I mean? Like the open people are doing a good job and trying to like be honest about it, but like I don't see like Musk really thinking about his bias and like wondering if like maybe he does, you know.
He must, he's a human being, we all are aware, but I agree with you that there's a single-mindedness to the current space narratives, and I don't even, and again, I don't think that the people who push them tend to even really notice that they are single-minded about it, that they're just like, this is inherently what is true about our future in space. And I don't see a lot of people being like, well, okay, why do you think that, and is that true?
I think just in the research that I did looking at NACA, that was the organization that predated NASA, and uncovering the historical documents and looking at the photographs of this small group of white men that conceived of space. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because that's the way things were, and that's okay. So it's no like anger towards it, because I don't think you can apply 2021 the way that we see the world now to that. It's like, it's unrealistic, you know what I mean? And it's like, so I just think it's good to understand that history. I think it's really important to understand. Somebody in the chat brought up about Russia sent the first woman to space. I always have people bring that up, and I know, and it's cool, it's really important, and it's good. And again, I'm not really talking about if women ever went to space, because they have.
And also in that point, the Russians did send one woman to space, and then they did not send another woman to space for a very, very long time. So it was a publicity stunt in of itself. And again, not to,
that I think that's important. And I feel a little bit of like, I think you and I talked about this on some of our other calls, is like, is that sort of what's happening now? Again, not to take away from the women that have been up there, but is that the best thing to do? Does that help us the most? And I'm looking at it from a broader perspective of, okay, going up to space is one thing, but what else is possible through, utilizing space-based assets, or utilizing the sun, or energy, or something else that we can take to be like fixing, Earth. I'm really interested in like the Earth science aspect, and like how like space science, and that kind of like that space. And then if you look at like a pretty simple idea, why would we apply the same thinking to space that has like messed up Earth as like our plan B? So like, we're going to do that up there. And as an international relations theorist and a space theorist, you can see, just look at orbital debris mitigation, look at like the orbital slots in geostationary and how they're spoken for. And I made a joke, like, they go faster than like a VIP booth at the Buddha bar in the 90s, which, it's just, I try to make people laugh, and think a little bit, because I think a lot of the writing in the space community and about space is very dry, and the writing within the feminist community tends to be very kind of angry. And I don't believe in either of those. I think we can still talk about things and have fun, and it can be smart, but entertaining a little bit too. I think Mary Roach does a fantastic job of that. She's a science writer, and it's funny.
Yeah, but I also want to give a shout out to somebody else in the chat is bringing up the podcast Celestial Citizen, which I have listened to, and I highly recommend everybody to go. They have on a wide variety of people who are talking about a lot of these same things, and are trying to provide some of these alternative perspectives. And one of the people who I think she was on there, who I spoke to for my New Yorker article, Timiabi Aganaba, and who's a space lawyer, who works also in international relations. And I think one of the things she said on that podcast was just about the fact that space, like you're saying, it's an opportunity it's something that everybody in the world now has to deal with. So it's really an opportunity for everybody in the world, including the global South and Western countries. And like these are problems that we all have to tackle together, like space debris, and we're not doing a great job of it. So
totally. And I think that, you know, as you write about space, it's like you mentioned something on a call to me, like people don't really realize or think about that we're already in space.
mm-hmm.
Like there's this false, you know, like separation.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe because we can't see it, you know, like what's happening, that it's harder to understand. And then you have like the climate deniers and the flat earthers and the anti-vaxxers and this group of people that are denying science or kind of making their own science up. And I think, you know, it's important to acknowledge that it's a real thing, and it's not just like one person wearing like a tinfoil hat walking around, but like it really has an effect on our livelihood. I mean, just look at how the anti-vaxxers and all of this stuff has played out with COVID. And so I think I find it like when I meet someone on an airplane once who's like, seems like a totally normal person, and then they tell me the flat earther thing and they really do believe it. And I'm just like, when it first started, I thought they were kidding. I didn't know, but I think it's important to look at like counterculture beliefs and how they can seem very sophisticated when you have a production quality that's pretty good and you have a YouTube channel and you self-publish and you go buy a degree online. And it's one of the things I try to teach my kids is something can look really sophisticated and polished and have high production quality, and it doesn't mean it's true,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so I think that's kind of something that like in the space community to consider, and why I push for an increase in scientific knowledge, because it feels like between when people graduated from school and maybe they didn't study that much science in school to like where they are now, like how did we get here?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's, my friend Lamar says, it's not that they're uneducated, but they're miseducated. And I think that's like an important thing to consider in all of this. We're talking about the state of space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is, you know, and coming from Hollywood and an entertainment background, what Hollywood puts out of like what happens in space, I think is like, you know, maybe people watch movies and they get confused, or like the Star Trek. I don't know, you know what I mean?
A number of times. So like there's a famous scene in Star Wars where they go through an asteroid field and C-3PO says like the chances of successfully navigating an asteroid field are 1 in blah, blah, blah. And there's like rocks flying everywhere. And probably one of the biggest things that I always have to explain to people who don't know is that, yeah, if you went to the asteroid belt, you would see like one rock and then there would just be empty space. And like, there's not rocks like flying at you. And yeah, with Star Trek, it's also like, it makes it look so easy. They're just on like this wonderful cruise ship basically, but like,
yeah,
you know, going into space, the people on the Inspiration 4, they all experienced certain levels of space sickness when they got up there. You can see in all of their early photos, one of the things that happens is your face gets like puffy because the blood suddenly starts rushing up in all of these different places. Yeah, like the physiological changes that happen while you're in space are pretty severe. And it's not just like, oh, we can build a hotel in space and people will go there and have a great time. Like,
totally.
they're also going to be kind of miserable some of the time. So for their tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah, and it's like, why do we need to go up and do that? Besides, like, if you think about the overview effect and like how cool it would be to see Earth, like that's what I think would be neat. But we have these vast amounts, like somebody brought up one of the comments I got on Space Review was like, why don't we try to like do more with the ocean of like, you know, we're colonizing Mars, is like, why not? Like Cocoon is like one of my favorite movies from when I was a kid. Like, you know, why are we needing to go and do all that? Like, we've got some stuff to think about here on Earth. And I make the joke that like the Antarctica ice bar party, like, you know, Antarctica's there. Have you ever taken the drive from LA to Vegas? Like, there's a lot of space in between there that seems like Mars. You know what I mean? Like, why are we needing to go all the way there? is it because you don't like the temperature here? And it's like, well, you're kind of responsible for that. Humans are responsible. So like maybe we should, I mean, like, I don't know, like as a movie or something, you think like you colonize Mars, like Pauly Shore and Biodome, like it all works out, and then you mess up the biodome.
Except for if you even look at the Biosphere 2 experiment that happened, they had a lot of problems. I mean, it's a big complicated thing, and they'll tell you all kinds of different things about the ways that it was successful in a lot of ways too, obviously, but they had, like suddenly their oxygen was just like running out and they couldn't figure out why for a long time. And like, imagine you're doing that, but you can't just leave and be back in the Earth's atmosphere if something like really terrible goes wrong. Like,
totally. Is someone, let's see what some of the comments here are saying. Biodome, yeah. I mean,
I'm expecting a Biodome reference. I know.
Adam, have you ever seen it? I don't think so.
Some 90s kids here, right?
No. Have you seen Biodome with Pauly Shore?
Of course, yeah.
Oh, really? Okay.
It came out when I was like the exact age for it. I was like 11 or something when it came out. So
yeah, that's the perfect age. So at least we made you guys laugh a little bit. Let's see. It's wild that folks deny science and feel like they're betraying their politics. I think that's definitely it. It plays a huge role, and how polarizing. It's really upsetting, just in my short life, watching before, having different political ideas was just something you didn't speak of in polite society. And now it's like, we can't have a dinner party with, two different groups because they wouldn't even sit in the same room. And I think it's really sad, but I think I've witnessed it's deteriorating, our democracy, it's hurting our country. It hurts our soft power. It's like, I don't think people like really understand how bad it is when they're on these like different sides, which is why in, our discussions about space, it's not about that. Like, if you have different political views, fine. I definitely like, I can understand both perspectives. Why can't more people do that? We were talking about that too, Adam, that like, you're very much like that.
I tried to at least recognize that the person who I'm speaking to is a human being, which means that the crazy mess that I have going inside my head, they've got that too. And they're struggling with whatever else is going on in their lives and anything else. And they have a particular perspective and they've ingested certain things that causes them to say these things. And it's not just that they're like, I feel like a lot of times people feel like people on the other side of some issue are just saying these things to like antagonize them.
Right.
And it's almost like a self-centered thing of like, it's not about you. It's actually this person has an entirely other perspective and you need to acknowledge and sort of recognize that and try, I hope, to understand where they're coming from if you actually want to engage with them and actually want to try to talk to them on their level.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think it's travel really helps, the more places that you go and see other cultures and realize that people have very different ways of doing things. It's not necessarily wrong, and understanding culture. I think education really helps. I think about what I thought I knew when I was 25, and it's sort of terrifying that like I was walking around the world able to drive a car and like knowing so little compared to what I know now, like, sure. Oh my goodness. And just because people can Google things and look it up, like Wikipedia is not an academic source, is like drilled into my head, but it's really true because it doesn't mean like that's, where you get your information. Because like I was talking about how, incorrect information can still have very high production value. Well, then it can get into a Wikipedia page and it's still, you know what I mean? Like that's where it's like, it's not an encyclopedia.
Or there's there's Conservapedia, there's Liberalpedia or whatever that you can go and just like find kind of like siloed information. And
exactly.
Yeah.
Let's see here if we have any other questions. I don't think so.
I wanted to go back to this point that you've been touching on, that this sort of disconnect between science and politics, and the fact that people tie their belief in science to politics. But something more specific, Adam, I was reading, for example, your article in the Wall Street Journal about who's in charge of outer space. And now, of course, being the Wall Street Journal, a lot of people in the comments started making the point about regulation, like, oh, these bureaucrats now want to regulate the moon. And whether we like it or not, this is a political issue. Do we want more regulation? Do we want less regulation? So when it comes to a field like space, which is basically the new frontier, the new Wild West, what would be your responses to those questions about regulation? Why would we need more regulation? Why would we be against regulation?
I think that's an excellent point. I think that, we have the Outer Space Treaty, which is kind of like the law of the land when it comes to everything in space. It doesn't say a huge amount. It does say this stuff needs to be regulated, and the people in charge of regulating it are governments. And so in talking to different people on different sides of this, they'll say, people who are on the more laissez-faire side will say, like, well, too much regulation strangles innovation and we shouldn't go in there, and especially when we don't know what regulations we need or don't need. And I think that is a valid point. I think that that's something to listen to, but there's obviously going to be some kind of sweet spot, because you don't want to just let people go hog wild and do whatever they want. And I think that it is important. Again, we're going to just keep bringing up Elon Musk a lot probably, but he often complains about the FAA holding up his rocket launches. And it's like, well, do they have a point? Why are they holding up your rocket launches? Like, maybe you need to be listening to what they're doing, because what they're trying to do is supposedly in the interest of the entire US population, the people around you. And hopefully, if we're talking about regulations of the moon or orbital debris and stuff like that, these are issues that affect literally everybody on Earth. And that I think some good amount of regulation would be necessary in order to achieve these things in a sustainable, in kind of a in a way that is not going to make us repeat the same mistakes that we're doing here, like we're talking about. Layla, do you want to add anything?
I think you're right, and you brought up the FAA. My friend Ken Davidian is over there in the outer space office, and I had a conversation with him about his time. He's been there for quite a while. I think before that he was at NASA, of the private space flight, that he used to not have to deal with so much of that, of working on approving these requests, and that, they're juggling a lot of different things. And my intuition would be like, if something got denied, it would be for safety. One of the arguments that I make in my my thesis was like, the private sector is able to deliver for a lot less, but there's not the transparency in terms of safety. And there's been reports from NASA of, they're concerned. And so when you get into this public-private partnership and everyone's saying, rah, 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 it's so much cheaper, we cut costs, I argue, well, okay, but we have independent contractor jobs with no benefits, that they build this piece, they work on this project, and it's like in the entertainment industry, they're done when it's over, you know what I mean? And it's like, is that really the best for people? What about when I do my research and I can look at NASA and all their demographics information, it's publicly available. When I tried to do my research and I'm looking at SpaceX or Blue Origin, going on to their website, all I have is it's not as transparent. The only thing that I could do is build a data set on their jobs that they were hiring when I was working on my thesis, to look at that, what they were offering and where it was at. And so I think it's really important to think about, and I emphasize this a couple of times, this is not just the price of things, it's the cost. The cost to people, that just because it's cheaper doesn't mean it's always better. And if there's a lack of transparency in a private sector spaceflight, do you really want to be going up there when there's not as much regulation? And so I think, there's a lot of things to consider. One of the the points that I keep emphasizing is like, why don't we talk more about this, and that ad hoc space governance is not working. And now it's just expanding with these private sector space companies, and everyone is kind of like on board. And I'm going, hey, there's no global space code. There's no clear rules for all of this. And if I bring up the OST, it's like, oh, well, you know, there's the Space Act that got passed, I think, with Obama, that like opened things up. And so I think it's like people, like you said, Adam, they want this to go faster, faster, faster. And I'm like, what are some of the security concerns here? Is this really the best for people who are hired in, you know, some off the wall place like in Texas? Because typically these space companies, they take up a lot of room. So they have to be like in, you know, Texas, in the area, or here we have a lot of them in LA, but they're nowhere like that.
Yeah.
They're not in mid city proper. And so it's like, we're bringing in contractors from these areas and then letting them all go. I don't know. I just feel like, shouldn't the American people be united in fighting for like good, high quality work?
Well, and again, when the alternative, or when Elon Musk tweeted about his frustration with the FAA, one of the things he said was, now humanity will never become multiplanetary. And I'm like, there's a lot of there's a lot of space between you not getting to launch your rocket today and humanity one day not being able to settle on other planets. Like, those are conflating those two issues, and again, pushing the like, this has got to happen as quickly as possible, to me feels disingenuous and is more about what you personally want to happen, as opposed to what should or is the best thing to happen.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds to me like I would put my kids in a timeout for acting like that. You know what I mean? Like, you don't get to like have your way. You didn't get your way, so you're going to have a tantrum. Like,
yeah,
I think there's too many grownups having tantrums, and we need to like, you know, tamp that down and like start acting like adults and being civilized. And I think it's really interesting. I mean, you're on Twitter a lot more than I am, but I just take a look at it and I'm like, ooh, like, it's like,
I wish I was on it less, but it's part of being a journalist. You have to.
No, you have to. I mean, but it's like, we need to treat each other with a little bit more just respect. Like you said, we're all human beings, and it's like, I don't know. I think it is really interesting. Like, there's so much to talk about, especially when you're bringing up space. And then you've got your sci-fi, you know, aspect, and then your private space flight, and it's like, so
sort of the real world versus the fantasy world, these kinds of things. I just want to ask Daniel, did we answer your question, or?
Yes, I think that was a very good point. I mean, the way I see it is that when there's something that affects everybody, of course, whether we like it or not, it needs to be regulated. And the point of regulation is to make that activity perhaps as equitable or as equitable for everyone, without avoiding a situation where, because this is what you want to do, you are indirectly going to be affecting other people. And I mean, to me, that those calls for, you know, extreme deregulation can be a bit contradictory, because at the end of the day, regulation is there precisely to protect everyone in an equitable way. And I think that's especially important when we are speaking about space, because like you have repeatedly said, it's an unregulated area. We still don't know much about it. And, you know, we have billionaires playing around with these technologies and playing around with things as if things were their own playground to play with, not understanding that in the end all of humanity is involved in this.
And also talking as if they represent all of humanity. They're saying we're democratizing space, we're increasing access to space. Whereas the disconnect between that statement and what they're actually doing is often, there's a gap there again. So,
and in a long-term, perhaps philosophical way, it's very interesting too, because we can ponder: are we getting to a point where these billion-dollar companies are becoming more powerful and richer than a lot of governments around the world.
Mhm.
So while we are claiming for less regulation, are we really looking at the future, a possible future, where private companies will be not helping governments, but competing with governments for resources and for science and technology development? And to me, that sounds pretty scary.
Absolutely.
It's terrifying, especially when you consider something. I remember the space conference I was in before COVID, the International Astronautical Congress in Washington, D.C. in 2019. I spoke with a couple people that were talking a lot about platinum mining, asteroid mining, and the platinum, and that will produce trillions of dollars. And it's like, well, when someone gets that, what does that look like for everyone who doesn't have that? I think that it's really important when we're talking about this private space industry, we're not just talking about people going up and taking like a joyride up to space. We're talking about the potential to widen the wealth gap in a way that it's like I bring up in my article. It's like that movie Elysium, the sci-fi movie of like the inequality where everybody's on this like perfect like thing that's not in on earth, and then everyone that's left on earth is like in dirt and like, you know, competing for like basically scraps. And I feel like the wealth gap could potentially be widened in such a substantial way that like I think that's where you push. I go back to space education, increasing space education, and not from like, you know, the looking at the stars, but like how, you know, some of these factors affect, you know, our lives. I think as a mom, I feel like I have a responsibility to think about climate and what kind of, you know, world are my kids going to inherit. It's like, I think, you know, if you have anyone that you care about in your life, it's like this is a conversation that's really important and it matters. It's much more than just looking at, you know, sci-fi futuristic cool ideas. It's talking about our future.
Mhm.
And it's kind of scary that it's unfolding in such a manner that there are no clear rules or rules that are being followed, and it's this ad hoc space governance, which anyhow.
Yeah, it's also
We have, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
We have a question from Charles Dorr. Do you have an idea on how to get more women interested and involved in aerospace engineering, HSI, human factors, medicine, etc.?
I think that the STEM for young girls, that like that I've seen a major increase in that, and so I think there's a little bit more awareness. Personally, I feel like how do you get women more involved? You have to address the barriers to entry, why they may not be interested, why looking at going up into space and the way that space is viewed, what our priorities are not as female centric. I feel like everyone I've talked to in my research that are civilians, that are not space scientists, they would be much more interested in space and the sciences if they knew that they could focus it back on Earth and helping to address, you know, oppression on Earth. And that women are the women that I've talked to are more interested in space when they see that there would be a possibility to work on that, as opposed to just going up into space, but directing the resources of space and space-based assets back to Earth. I think that is where I go back to education, is that they don't know how do we get to them. You know, NASA has some really cool stuff on their website, but like I'm looking at it, it's like preaching to the choir. You know what I mean? I mean, people don't read this in like their spare time. Only nerds like, you know, me. Like, oh, NASA has an update on their website. It's like you're not reaching. Like when I look at popular culture magazines, or, you know, Us Weekly or my daughter's TikTok, like we got to get it onto there. Like those people need to care. I don't know how to do that.
So I also just want to bring up the point that like we're talking about increasing science education, stuff like that. And I do think that that's obviously really important. But in that science education, I would like to also see more well-roundedness of everything, including like philosophy and history and stuff like that, like we're also talking about. And me and some other space journalists like Shannon Sterone and a couple of other people, we kind of jokingly refer to ourselves as space humanists, because like there's not enough humanities focus as well within, like, sure, it's science, it's engineering, it's technology. Those are all really cool and really important. But I think, and I even think that this is a way to get a wider variety of people involved, because maybe people are more interested in talking about the philosophical aspects of this, which are important, which we need to make important, I think, as well. Like SpaceX should have a person who is thinking about these things somewhere in their staff, and I know that they don't because I've asked them for it. So
I think that's such an important point, is that like the only reason I was able to come up with some of these ideas is I don't have a science background and I'm not an engineer. I was a creative director. I worked on Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, and I'm a mom and I'm an artist. So later in my life, I went back to school for graduate school, and then, you know, became aware of some of these things and was able to kind of combine my areas of expertise. But I guarantee you, when I went to that conference at the International Astronautical Congress in 2019, like there weren't other artists walking around. Like there was like, it felt like 10,000 people. And it was like, they're all kind of in gray suits and like talking to each other. And I was looking around going like, if this is the community, the global community of the movers and shakers in space, like that, this is the problem. And it was actually really like this moment where all of my research kind of came together. And that's when I came up with this idea of astrofeminism, of like putting a name to this, because it was like this palpable lack of, you know, what is missing here. And it was, it's funny too, like growing up in Los Angeles, and we have a very different vibe than the people in DC. And, you know, it's more casual, and it's like, it was just like a very, very kind of closed, formal, you know, set. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with formality, but it was like, there was definitely, it was like a silo thinking, like, you know, not a lot of other ideas were presented. And I think that, how do you get more people interested in that? I think it's also confidence, that they feel like they could. I mean, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have ever felt I was smart enough to participate in these kind of conversations, because I don't know if you've ever heard of imposter syndrome, but they find that like people that are smarter have a problem with like, are they ever going to find out? And I think it was like coming to terms with like, I'm smart enough to have this conversation, you know what I mean? And it's like, yeah, it took until I was like really pretty recently, when I graduated just recently from Harvard, like, you know, you think, well, you went to Harvard, you feel pretty smart. No, because everyone there is way smarter. Like, I'm like, you know, not the smartest one. It's like, you're not that smart. If you go there, you just feel like you're going through a meat grinder and you cry a lot. So it's like, then getting through that, well, you know, compared to regular people, that I think is like the ability to just have the conversation, you know, to want to be curious, to read, to increase your own knowledge. I think that's when people keep asking, how do we increase women? Tell them they're smart enough. You know, I mean, it's I can't tell you how many people have come to my house, see all my books and everything, and they go, I could never be that smart. And I go, yeah, you could. I just read those. Like we all start out, you know, with like the same level of intelligence. I just never stopped reading. I mean, it's really pretty simple.
You know, last year, and related to these comments that you're making, last year we had a speaker named Emily Calandrelli. She runs a science show for kids on Netflix. It's called Emily's Wonder Lab. But she gave a very interesting presentation where she was giving some very basic examples about barriers of entry to STEM for women. Which I found very interesting, because these are things that we don't usually think about. For example, she was saying about how when NASA came up with the spacesuits were, of course, designed after the anatomy of a male body. They designed those spacesuits without a female body in mind. So when women finally started going to space, those spacesuits were just very uncomfortable. When women started going to space, the bathrooms were not adapted for issues like menstruation, for example. Parking lots, when women decide to have kids, when they are in their pregnancy period, they find that parking lots for disabled people, for women, are not near the entrances to offices, which, to a man who won't be able to understand the experience of being pregnant, it sounds like it is not a big deal. But for somebody who is pregnant, walking that extra distance might make a difference between, being excited to go to your job or saying, oh, this is very annoying, and things of the sort. So sometimes it seems like, oh, wow, we've come a long way. But sometimes we look at examples like this, or the lack of parental leave too, for example. Mm-hmm. So we look at examples like this, and it seems very disappointing that even though it may seem that we've come a long way, there are some things that we simply seem completely unaware about, So how do you personally feel about where we are right now in terms of our culture in general, but also specifically STEM culture in regards to biases against women?
Caroline Criado Perez writes about gender data and what you're bringing up in terms of the parking lot. And if you're a pregnant woman and you have to pee all the time or you can't walk, yes, I think that the world is designed for men, even from how you hold your phone, it's too big. The seatbelt kills you, like all of this stuff. I highly recommend her book, Caroline Criado Perez. I'll give it to you in the chat. But she's talking about the gendered data. So for in a world that's designed mostly by white men, and she even gives examples of like Wikipedia, that like who's deciding, who's monitoring Wikipedia. And so you'll have female Nobel Prize winners, and you get like a sentence or something, and then you have a Marvel superhero with 25 pages. It's really important to understand, because we're so much on the computer, we're so digital, that this world, everything that we are using, the technology, that it's really like, there's not equality within that. So the design, the behavioral design of the world is a problem. And then if you look at what is projected in terms of the AI, there's not enough women designing this. And so we're like, the compounding effect of this is going to be pretty severe. So I think it's a really important thing to consider. But just for me personally, I'm smart enough to be involved in this, but I don't have the science education. I can weigh in on it, but we need more women that have the science education that want to go into these kind of fields, data science programming.
And I think, again, just making more space for the fact that you don't need to necessarily have a background in physics or math or engineering in order to contribute something to this, because those ideas just tend to be often like dismissed of like, oh, well, but that's just whatever fuzzy stuff that we don't need to worry about. And it's like, again, people in STEM and people in science and engineering can sometimes be very kind of narrow-minded in the ways that they think about the world, in what they think is important about the world, and not listening to the fact that there might be other things to think about. So
absolutely. I mean, just the people that are here and participating in this talk, you can tell just by their questions and their interaction that they're very thoughtful and aware of these kind of issues. And so I'd be interested to hear from any of them. What do you think you're asking us?
Exactly. Yeah,
do you think that we're missing anything, or is there anything else that you guys would like to discuss? Because we're going to wrap up at 12:20. And Adam, do you have any other things to add, or any projects you're working on?
I am working on a sci-fi novel about the difficulty of knowing other people and also aliens, and that's kind of my big passion project at the moment. And otherwise, I'm working on a bunch of articles all the time, because that's how I make money, and I enjoy it. I'm very lucky to get to make money by putting words down on a page. So,
And if we want to know more about your book or the updates of what's happening in terms of, you know, from the concept to it being something that we can pick up, we'll follow you on Twitter.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I also have a website, which is adamspaceman with 2 N's.com. So, and I post my usually like latest articles and stuff like that there. And Layla, what are you working on?
This conference, I had to get all my kids out. No, it's quiet here. I'm really enjoying it. No, I have the articles for Space Review. I'm working on a book, Astrofeminism, but at more of the book proposal stage to get it to the next level. But I'm pretty sure it'll come out by 2022, given the pace of all this and that I'm not in graduate school anymore. So I don't have to write any more papers. And tomorrow I'm going to be talking about science and elitism with my friend, the physicist Lamar Glover, who's amazing and fun. And so that's at 11:10 a.m. Pacific tomorrow. And I have a website too, but it's astroacademy.space, which, you know, is the same as I update it with articles and stuff like that. And yeah, I think this has been really fun, and I hope that the people that are 19 participants
got something out of it. Yeah, I see the one point in our Q&A from Charles Dorn that yes, Werner von Braun, who helped, you know, conceive of our Apollo project and stuff like that, wrote a sci-fi book himself where he had a colony on Mars and they had a leader named Elon. And I learned this recently, and then I think I tweeted it with the like a quote it's attributed to Mark Twain, but who knows who actually said it. Truth, of course, truth is stranger than fiction. Fiction has to make sense. Like,
yeah, I think that is really kind of funny.
Exactly.
Well, you know, science elitism has been a recurring topic throughout the conferences, other previous panels today. And I mean, considering our political situation, I guess it's science elitism is something that we should continue talking about. So Layla, we very much look forward to your session tomorrow on that. And we're about to close this session. So thank you, Adam. Thank you, Layla, for joining us. And we are running more panels. We have a full day today. So please join us in the next presentations. Thank you, everyone, very much.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks for having us.
Bye, Adam.
Bye.